Inder Singh is joining us from Oakland, California today. He is the CEO and founder of Kinsa Health, a company that way before anyone was even talking about a COVID outbreak was working to contain it and warn the world about it. He will go into more about what that means and what he was doing. Prior to trying to prevent the world from being caught unaware of the pandemic, he was working at the Clinton Global Health Initiative, where he brokered agreements between 70 developing countries and 20 70 developing countries and 20 pharmaceutical agencies to reduce the drug costs of malaria, TB, AIDS, and other diseases, and saved over $1 billion with a B, dollars in the process of doing so, enabling millions of people to get access to that. So then, after doing some of this work, he decides, hey, wait a second here, the private sector is a way that I can make an impact, but he says, I gotta get a little more educated first. He goes on to get 3 degrees from MIT and Harvard. Of course, after he goes where? Thank you, U of M. He doesn't just go to U of M, though. He doesn't just show up, become a student, sign up, and then get 4 years and he's done. My man creates his own degree. He literally created his own degree before it was a degree. He'll tell you a little bit about that. On top of that, he created something, show of hands, who's heard of Dance Marathon? This is it. It's the guy. That's where it all started. So without further ado, Mr. Inder Singh, thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. I am excited to be back on campus, my first time in years, given COVID. I've got my Michigan Entrepreneur shirt on, so I'm really excited to be here with you. Before we get started, I kind of want to know who's in the audience. So can you tell me if you guys are undergraduate students? Lots of undergrads, great. All right, how about graduate students? How about non-students? A few, okay. How many of you have aspirations to be an entrepreneur? Lots. How many of you have been an entrepreneur? You started your own organization, nonprofit or for-profit? A bunch, that's great. And can you also put your hands up again to tell me how many of you are part of Dance Marathon in any way? Okay, this is near and dear to my heart. You're going to hear a little bit more about it. It changed my life, and it's the reason why I do my work today. So let's go to the next slide here. I'm going to follow the mantra, and we're going to talk a little bit about my journey through the try, risk, fail, do framework, and then we'll take some questions. So I'm Inder. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Kinsa. Our mission is to curb the spread of infectious illness through earlier detection and earlier response. Specifically, what we've created is an early warning system for outbreaks spreading. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we saw COVID weeks before the healthcare system did. For years, we've been able to predict where and when flu will spread. And I believe this is one of the biggest problems in public health in the world today. And I believe that because 7 of the top 12 killers of children under 5 are infectious diseases. And because if you think about it, an infectious disease affects, 95% of the world's population at least once per year. You probably get a cold or a flu at least once a year. So that's why we're working on this problem. But I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about Kinsa in a moment. Let's talk about the journey to get there. So what did I try? I had the great pleasure and honor of being the founder of Dance Marathon, and that changed my life. And so what I will tell you and what I would encourage you guys to do is take advantage of being here on campus. It's a rare opportunity you get in life, and you will look back on it and you will realize how rare an opportunity it is to join with your fellow students and do things outside of the classroom. Start things, build things, experiment with things. And it's one of the great things that I had the chance of doing on campus. I spent more time doing activity stuff than I did spending time in the classroom. I didn't go to class very much. But I think it was a great experience, and so I would encourage you guys to try and take advantage of this time. The biggest lesson I learned in Dance Marathon was how to motivate people. And it's a lesson I learned that I take to today. How do you actually inspire someone to pursue a problem or a cause without the incentive of money, without the incentive of the traditional things that operate in the real world? And it was a tremendous lesson for me. I also had the privilege of working at the Clinton Health Access Initiative. This was a dream job, and I'll tell you just a short bit about it, but I'll tell you how it affected my journey as an entrepreneur. At the Clinton Health Access Initiative, I ran around the world and I brokered deals between heads of state and ministers of health at 70 developing countries and more than 20 pharmaceutical companies. And we dropped the price of drugs for AIDS, TB, and malaria by up to 93% in under 5 years. What a cool job running around the world and using business skill to help poor people in poor countries. It was amazing. And all the stuff that you learn in undergrad or graduate business school are the theories that we applied. Applying the theories is much harder than it sounds like, but how do you reduce the price of a drug? Well, you reduce the price of the inputs. You help reduce risk in terms of the buyer community. We can come back and talk about some of that stuff if there's of interest, but it was a real dream job. I loved it. I ran around the world out of a suitcase with no home between 16 countries over the course of 5 years, living in hotels. It was awesome. At the end of that, I found the problem that I would spend the next 12 years of my life pursuing. And that is a problem that I think will resonate with you now that you've lived through COVID. And the sad fact is that the world has almost zero information about where and when infectious illness is starting. So I'll pose the question I posed when I started Kinsa. How do you stop an outbreak before it becomes an epidemic or, God forbid, a pandemic if you don't know where and when it's starting? As we all know, having lived through COVID, you don't. And it kills millions, and it affects the system. It costs livelihoods and lives. And that was the problem statement we started with in founding Kinsa. It was not a technology, it was not a product, it was a problem statement. So with that in mind, I am going to let the video do the explanation for me. I'm taking the easy way out here and let you guys see what we're all about.
Imagine how different our lives would be if we knew, weeks ahead of time, where and when an illness outbreak was going to happen. Could we have more medications and vaccinations in stock? More hospital beds or PPE available where they're needed? Could our communities stay healthier with local schools and offices free of outbreaks? At Kinsa, we make all of that happen. We're an illness insight solutions business with a mission to curb the spread of infectious illness through early detection and response. Kinsa aggregates hundreds of public health data sources and captures the key data set needed for early illness detection, real-time, hyperlocal data right as symptoms start. Through a novel illness support and two-way communication system, we access unique data the healthcare system misses entirely. Data from mildly symptomatic individuals, well before they see a doctor or go to the lab. Data on how fast an illness spreads in the home or in school, a good indication of how fast it will spread in the community. And data from underserved communities. These families are often larger and underinsured, seeking care late or not at all. Since 2013, Kinsa has used this data to create the earliest available insights on where illness is starting and spreading, and where it is forecast to spread months in advance. In fact, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, Kinsa's system detected unusual illness patterns, providing a 3-week advance warning of COVID hospitalizations and deaths. Kinsa provides our insight solutions to public health departments, healthcare institutions, and illness product companies to help them target messaging, forecast illness-driven demand, and prevent community outbreaks. Join us in growing a global early warning system for illness that is valuable to individuals, communities, and industries, and most importantly, saves lives and livelihoods. Kinsa.
So let's just talk about how we're accomplishing it. When we first set out to solve this problem, how do you detect the spread of an outbreak early? How do you forecast who and where it's going to impact people? We asked ourselves the question, we told ourselves there's got to be existing data sets that can do this. All we need to do is apply some advanced data analytics to healthcare data, and we can do this better than it has been done before. We were wrong. When we looked at existing healthcare data sets, even combined with social media, Google search queries, tweets, Facebook, even combined with weather patterns that theoretically could affect the spread of an infectious illness, you couldn't get the signal. You couldn't understand with granular detail where the outbreak was occurring or spreading. We needed to go get better data. For those of you that work in engineering, you will probably know the mantra, garbage in, garbage out. Any analysis is dependent upon the data, the quality of the data input. If the data going in is not good, the results are virtually useless. And that's what was happening with outbreak detection and prediction. The input data was bad. So we asked ourselves, how do we get specific data? This isn't rocket science. If you want to know where and when an infectious illness is starting and spreading, you have to know where symptoms are starting, even from mildly symptomatic people who are not yet able to go and see the doctor or not yet ill enough to get a test. You want to know how fast it's spreading, and you want to know how it progresses. You all know this. This is an easy explanation for me now post-COVID. Some people get exposed to a disease. Some people get symptomatic and get better. Others get sicker and sick enough to go see the doctor. The healthcare system doesn't see that progression, doesn't know what the percentages of people are. We asked ourselves, how can we get that data? What's the lowest cost, lowest friction way to do that? To do that, we invented this, the connected thermometer. We invented a product that exists, we reimagined a product that exists in the home, and it operates as a trigger. When a thermometer goes off in the home, someone's sick. So we know that we can use that as a mechanism to start a communication, collect the data through an app that we need, and start getting those 3 data sets. A lot of people told us this was the wrong thing to do. A lot of venture capitalists said, hardware is a bad business. What do you mean you're going to do this? 6 years after we introduced it, it worked. We then spent 3 years of hardcore time analyzing the data to confirm that we could predict flu better than anybody else could. Flu was the natural, it occurs every year. It has good data behind it, so can we beat the existing system with flu? And then the pandemic hit, and our world got turned upside down. I'll come back to that in a moment, but let's talk a little bit about some of the other challenges. This is a class on starting a company, right? This is a class on entrepreneurship. Let's talk about the crazy things that happened along the journey. And let me first start by saying, wow, what a complex business model we have, right? Most companies build a product, get it to millions of users, and that's their business. We had to do that. Then only could we analyze the data to develop the models for outbreak prediction and forecasting. Then only could we sell the insights that was our ultimate market. That was the goal. We are extremely lucky to be supported by venture capitalists who are patient, because that started 10 years ago. So, complex business model. That's one of the reasons I have gray in my beard. It's really challenging. It's so broad. But along the way, we had lots of problems. I like to say that most companies are lucky if they survive 3 near-death experiences. We've survived 5, meaning you ran out of money, you had to do a layoff, something severe happens. And especially as an early-stage company, it's really hard to live through that. I remember a time when my chief of staff, we didn't have a CFO until a year ago. We didn't have a VP of finance, so we were doing it with young guys straight out of college. And I remember one of my former chiefs of staff, 5 years after he left the company, asked me, what happened for those 6 months where all my models showed that we had $0? How are you continuing to pay people? It's because we raised. It was hand to mouth. We would raise money, we would pay it out. We would raise money, we would pay it out. That's a challenge that some of you may go through if you start a company. Another very big challenge, our first connected thermometers, which were proving the data, all of a sudden Apple and Google took the headphone jack away. That's how we connected. We created this really low-cost thermometer that connected to a smartphone. CVS and all these big retailers are carrying us. Suddenly, they pull the headphone jack away, and we basically had to restart the entire company from scratch 4 years into it. That was really hard. Another example, and that was the restarting the company. I'll come back to this point in a moment. How many of you have worked at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control? How many of you work in public health? How many of you are public health students? Okay, I will be very candid with you about this. I am very lucky to be the CEO of Kinsa. If I was on my board, I would have fired me. I wasted 18 months and millions of dollars chasing the federal government during the COVID crisis. We were helping them. We were helping them mostly free of charge. there was no sustainable revenue stream there. There was no sustainable revenue stream there. We shirked all our corporate clients who wanted our help. A team of 3 serviced them for 18 months. And we had to go back to them. And luckily, those clients, Tylenols of the world, the Mucinexes of the world, I can say that publicly, there's case studies with them, took us back and embraced us around these insights. But I'm very lucky to be the CEO of Kinsa through that period of time. And we can talk about the challenges that public health has in embracing new kinds of innovation that fall outside of drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines, if anyone cares to. And mind you, one of my board members is an advisor to CDC Director Walensky. Getting a little public healthy. All right. This is the map that was released on March 14th, 2020 at healthweather.us. At this particular point in time, there were case counts in King County, Washington, and Santa Clara County, California for COVID. There were no cases anywhere else in the United States. And our data strongly suggested that there was an unusual transmitting disease. Febrile incidence was elevated above cold and flu levels. Transmission was highly elevated, way above traditional cold and flu levels. And this is that hotspot map. So this was carried on that day by the New York Times and by a number of other publications. And at that moment in time, I was really worried. As an entrepreneur, I spent it was an amazing experience as an entrepreneur. For the next 30 days, I was on air 3 to 4 hours a day, probably for 60 days. So as an entrepreneur, to see your company getting that kind of attention is great. As a former public health professional, I was angry. And I was angry because it was news fodder. It wasn't being used by the authorities to actually respond to the pandemic. So that was an interesting journey along the way. All right, I will conclude with that and let you guys, let Eric ask me questions and let you guys ask me questions too. Guys, thank you so much for having me here. It's really a privilege to be here.
So I'm wondering, as I'm sitting here listening to you, of those 5 near-death experiences, what's the most challenging one?
I think that's a hard one to say. When you believe, so to be clear, for me, I don't know that this is transferable to other entrepreneurs, but maybe it is. I think most entrepreneurs are a little crazy because you believe that you can do something that others can't. So you have to be like a little confident, a little crazy. For me, this was a passion project. This wasn't just a company. This is a problem I had been working on for years and I wanted to solve, right? And you have a belief about how to solve it. But 4 years in, before you can get to a real answer on that question, things stop. When we lost our entire product line because the headphone jack went away, was a really hard period of time because I spent 4 years working my tail off, 90 hours a week, and we're on the cusp of proving something, but we haven't proven it, and you have to restart the whole endeavor. So there are these rules that there's this framework that I often suggest to students about if you're going to start a company, there are 3 reasons to start a company. And only 3 reasons to start a company. If all 3 of these things are true, run as fast as you possibly can and do it. The same would apply to joining an early stage company. If anything under 10 people, same rules apply. You're basically an entrepreneur if you're at that stage. One of those rules is you're so passionate about the problem that you're willing to spend 10 years of your life dedicated to it. And even if it fails at the end of the day, even if you have a massive chip on your shoulder at the end, you'll be proud of yourself for working on that problem. That was true for me. So 4 years in, I said, I got to give myself another 6 years to see where it gets to. And we restarted the company. I'll tell you the 2 other things before we go on. The other thing that I would say, the 2 other things I would say are the following. If you want to work with this group of people so badly that it doesn't matter the concept, you feel like you're going to learn, you just work as a great team. They resonate with you, you resonate with them. That's a great reason to join a team and start a company. And oh, by the way, try not to found a company by yourself. It's a lot harder than if you have someone that you truly trust. We'll talk about that later. The third thing that I would say is make sure there are near-term proxies for success. This is a human behavioral thing. If there are not near-term things that you can point to say, yep, I'm on the right track, it's going to be hard to keep motivating yourself to work those 90-hour weeks. So again, you're so passionate about the problem, doesn't matter if you spend 10 years, you'd still be proud of yourself for working on it. 2, you just absolutely want to work with this group of people. And 3, there are near-term proxies for success. Notice that compensation did not enter that framework in any way whatsoever. If all 3 of those first things that I mentioned are true, run as fast as you can and join that team or start that company. If 2 of the 3 reasons are there, maybe consider it. If it's 1, please run away from it as fast as possible because you won't sustain yourself for more than a year or 2. It's too hard. It's just too hard. Sorry.
That's okay. It's sound advice. I love whenever you're talking about that to students because I think it's a perfect way to frame it up in a very simple formula to kind of follow. Going back and thinking to the Inder who is pre-VC receiving money in 2014 when you get your $10 million to kind of get the thermometer going, what were the near-term proxies that you were talking to VCs about in order to get that investment in the door then?
Yeah, I mean, the first proxy was we're going to reimagine the thermometer. So A, we got to get FDA clearance. So any problem needs to be broken down. Like Elon Musk has this great grand plan that you've probably heard from Tesla. Like make a car that's super expensive, then make a cheaper car, then make a cheaper car, and that's how we're going to get electric cars going. I'm paraphrasing that grand plan. My grand plan was introduce the thermometer, get millions of users, analyze the data, sell the data, right? And I made many mistakes along the way, but that was basically the grand plan. So whenever I broke that down to VCs, it was we got to get the data. The first step in getting the data is getting the product out there and getting the millions of users. So that was the first set of goals.
And you clearly have a gift for storytelling. When you're storytelling in 2014 at these VCs, is it along this notion of saying, here's my steps, here's the iteration, here's where I'm going to collect the data, and trying to get them to understand the long-term play that you were trying to make, or is it getting them to understand, hey, this is a new thermometer, this is digital, this is going to revolutionize things? What angle did you take?
It's all vision. When you're raising from an early stage, it's all like, I'll put it a different way. If I'm going to give you money, what do I need to believe? Think about that question. I need to believe that A, you're sharp, B, you and your team are going to fight as hard as you possibly can and never give up, C, that there's actually a market here, that it's actually a real market here. I need to believe those things, right? So setting aside the concept of is there actually a market, if you could actually get the data, will people be willing to buy the insights? I'm setting that aside for a moment because that's an evaluation a VC could do. Those other 2 points are around passion, persistence, and smarts and experience, right? So you're just, it's really a passionate call to an investor to say, will you join me in this journey, right? And are you willing to take the risk because it's a long journey, right? And so it was really about vision for the product. Now, I had an unfair advantage. There's often this concept in VC circles, they talk about unfair advantages, right? An unfair advantage in VC circles is you just know the industry and have the connections that are so much more powerful than others do. So we're just going to believe that you've got the core basic premise right. And that's because I worked in the global health world and I ran these large-scale infectious disease programs and I worked for President Clinton and I had these connections and I had credentials like the University of Michigan. My graduate credentials were from Harvard and MIT, and that carried me a long way with VCs. I had an unfair advantage. For those of you that are coming straight out of school, it's going to be harder for you to argue that you have an unfair advantage unless you've taken advantage of the networks here at Michigan, the professors on your boards, et cetera. Try to figure out what your unfair advantage is.
Yeah, that's great. I'm thinking, so when you're pitching to VCs, in essence, you're tying these soft outcomes that you have to hard dollars that you need them to invest. Inder in 2022 looks back to Inder in 2014 and 2015 and would say, what? What advice do you give to yourself that you wish you would have known?
Avoid the headphone jack. Let's see. I don't know if I would have done it had I known how hard it was going to be. But I think that's why entrepreneurs are a little crazy. They think it's going to be easier than it actually is most of the time. If you're very, very lucky, you're like one of the 0.5% of people who start a company, less than that, whose company takes off and becomes a multi-billion-dollar animal within a few years. Like, gosh, God bless you. But for most of us, you go sideways before you go up. And the question is how, in the words of one of my favorite investors, keep going. Like, survival is a proxy for success. Just keep going. Just keep going.
Keep going. At what expense, of course, always becomes the question. How did you learn, and what lessons did you take away now in hindsight of how to balance passion and practicality?
Yeah, you don't want to be an optimist to the level where you're blinded to the realities of the data, right? You got to be data driven, and actually, the way that I would like to put it is you want to be a positive realist, not an optimist. You want to be positive on the possibilities that exist, but you also have to distinctly see what possibilities exist. I spent a lot of time over the years just, there's a couple Kinsans in the audience. My wife is in the audience. She's one of our executive team members at Kinsa. She knows how hard this has been, so she can comment at some point. I think I spent a lot of time pacing around and just envisioning what the possibilities were and like walking through my head about how we're going to get there, what are the risks, just literally, and that's what kept me going a lot of the time. So I don't think I've answered your question. What was your question again,
Talking
Eric?
about balancing. How do you balance, and how do you know when you're overextending in passion versus practicality? What checks did you learn along the way that?
I don't think I'm a good person to ask that, because I think if you ask my wife, I think she would tell you that I'm way past the point of burnout. To be clear, I'm way past the point. I'm way past the point of burnout. I've been past the point of burnout for 4 or 5 years. Sometimes you get tunnel vision, and you hear about tunnel vision from entrepreneurs. I have it. I know I have it. I'm way past the point of burnout. There are aches and pains in my body that I didn't know could exist, and they're there. But I promised myself I was going to give it that decade. I passed that decade about 6 months ago. And if you want to know an honest story, here's an honest story. I talked to my 2 lieutenants and said, "Can you guys take over?" Because I'm done. I'm so toasted. And their answer was no. We need to figure out how to get you back to the place that you can be comfortable, and here's our plan for that. And to be surrounded by people that believe that much that us as a team is going to work, it's amazing. It's so inspiring. So sorry, I'm getting a little emotional when talking about that.
No, with the problem that you're tackling, how could you not? And I think we're all better off for the fact that you've dedicated yourself and your family and colleagues have as well to this cause. So thank you for that.
Well, let me add one more thing. To be clear, I remember at the beginning of the entrepreneurial journey reading an article about and I'm giving you the dark side here because you guys need to know the dark side just like you need to know the positive side. And again, entrepreneurs are a little crazy because they believe they can do it. I remember in 2012 when we first started this, 2012, I still consider myself a startup. I'm 10 years in. That's a long time, guys.
That's Obama's first term.
That's a long time, exactly. So 2012, I remember reading an article about 2 entrepreneurs who killed themselves. They committed suicide. And what it talked about was the acute emotional ups and downs that a startup journey can bring. Even within one day, you can feel this elated high and this bottom. And I thought to myself, God, that's BS. I've been through startups. There's come on, man. No one can be suffering that bad from And I remember it was about 2016, 2017. We'd just gone through the restarting of the company, right? And I was feeling these acute emotional ups and downs. And I think my wife my wife at that time, called me out on it and said, you're all over the map. You're up and you're down and you're up and down. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's happening to me. Oh, it's happening to me. It's hard, guys. It's hard. If you go sideways for a long time, it's hard.
It was made easier because you had the experience and the network you did coming into it, as opposed to when you just graduated, you would have gone and started Kinsa, pre-Clinton Global Health, and so on. Talk a little bit about the experience that you had in cutting your teeth before you did this, and what your experience as a founder would have been like maybe if you hadn't.
Yeah, I got very lucky. Raising the first $2 million, we did it with a deck and a breadboarded thermometer, literally a breadboarded thermometer for those of you in EE. That's literally raised, and it was the fastest thing that happened. I was shocked at how fast we raised money. And what I learned in hindsight is because I had that unfair advantage. People were willing to give you a little money up front to pursue it, to see how it goes. But at the Series A, the next round of financing, they're going to hold you accountable to make sure you've made progress. And they don't really want you to raise on vision the next time. They want you to raise on progress. So I had a really tough time at the Series A because we had gotten the FDA approval, we had launched the thermometer, we were out there in the market, but people were now saying, okay, but that's great. Now you've proven you can do that, but your vision is this data stuff. You haven't taken any steps toward it. And I somehow got caught in the trap that many entrepreneurs do when they come out of an industry in a really interesting position, which is it's really easy to raise the first round. It may not be easy to raise the second or the third. And you really need to think about that journey. So to answer your question, I don't think I would have never gotten the money had I come straight out of college to pursue something like this. I don't believe I would have gotten the money.
How much did the experience shape your understanding of who the target market, who the audience was, who was going to be created value for to launch Kinsa? Because undoubtedly you had this thought, you had this passion, you had this vision of what it could be from the onset, but then you go through the professional experiences. How did that refine it?
There's a phrase called, that I like to use, which is strong beliefs weakly held. Have you guys ever heard that phrase? Has anyone ever heard that phrase before? I subscribe to that, which is, I have a hypothesis, it's a darn strong hypothesis. You're not moving me off it unless you give me 3 important pieces of data that all point in the right direction, right? But if you give me those 3 important pieces of data, they all are internally consistent and they point in the right direction, my hypothesis will immediately change. And so I believe in that. And I think we made a lot of pivots along the way, right? Our belief was larger families, underserved families are the early warning sentinel groups. People in those groups are frontline workers, they're retail workers often, they're underserved communities, you guys know this from the COVID situation, but they're larger, so they have more exposure to infectious diseases because there's more people in the family, and they have more exposure individually to a larger number of people. So we believed that along the way. We positioned everything in the thermometer against that. And one of the interesting things was to get feedback from VCs during the pitch, right? Like when they would start probing, any good investor is going to ask you some really tough questions. And they're going to say, how are you thinking about this product? Or how do you think about the data? What are the specific aspects of the data? Who are you going to sell that to ultimately? Right? And I think one of the things I would encourage you guys to do is if you're ever an entrepreneur and you're ever raising money, make sure that you use those meetings not just to pitch someone, but to elicit the insights that they have about the market that you're working on. Because one great thing about investors is they see lots of stuff. And they're usually pretty good at pattern recognition. So they're going to say, these group of companies have these similar attributes. Learn what those attributes are. Do you have experience with my market? Okay. Do you have my experience with my business model? Is it a SaaS business model? Is it a hardware business model? We had both. So I had to learn the hardware business model and what the metrics were of success around the hardware business model. I had to learn the SaaS business model and what the metrics were of success around there. What are the patterns for a successful SaaS company? What are the patterns for a successful hardware company? When you're introducing into retail versus e-commerce, what are the ways to do this? So remember that when you're talking to any investor, you not only want to pitch them on what you're doing, you want to come into that prepared by knowing who they are, what their expertise is, and what information you can get out of that conversation. If you are not using that conversation that way, you are doing yourself and your company a disservice. And oh, by the way, the more you ask them questions and elicit information, the more they're going to think you're really sharp and thoughtful, and they're more likely to invest. There's an old adage that if you ask for advice, you get money. If you ask for money, you get advice. And so ask for advice along the way.
So you talked about the idea that you pivoted a lot along the way, asking for money, asking for advice. Kinsa goes after years of trying to work with the public sector, work with the CDC, kind of get these initial presumed clients on board, to then saying, hey, wait a second, private sector, Lysol, Usenex company. This pivot happens because of the frustration, undoubtedly, but what opportunity within the pivot did you never appreciate?
Well, so interestingly enough, before the pandemic struck, we were already working with those companies, right? It was a very simple hypothesis. If we could tell you where and when flu was occurring, we could help you plan demand for your products. You would know where to put products on the shelf so you don't have stockouts. The flu product category is notorious for stockouts. Fever, cough, allergy, notorious for stockouts. You guys probably experienced it during COVID. You didn't have access to Lysol. You didn't have access to, Mucinex. You didn't have access to Tylenol or masks or other things. So it's notorious. It becomes more acute, obviously, in a pandemic situation, but it happens every year. So our hypothesis was really simple. We could tell you where and when to put your products. We could tell you where and when to message to make sure you're optimizing for demand. So illness is about to occur here, message there. Oh, by the way, you also need to have products there. And so it was a really simple hypothesis, and it worked. And so we started that journey well before the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, we made the call that we needed to focus on public health. We needed to help the public health system respond because clearly we were ahead of the public health system. Clearly we knew what was happening before the existing infrastructure. So the entire 98% of the organization pivoted to that, and we left our corporate clients behind. And again, we came back to them. We now work with a bunch of health plans. We now work with all of those sorts of companies that I talked about. And it's working again, but 18 months was a journey where we went after a particular vertical and there wasn't product market fit. And even if there's conceptual product market fit, there wasn't a willingness to pay. And one of the challenges you have with any new market, like to be clear, we're creating the market for outbreak analytics. There's never really been a seller of solutions for outbreak analytics. There's never really been that, right? So we've created the market for outbreak analytics. We've created the market for predicting demand for products associated with illness, infectious illness. And those are two brand new markets. In any new market, you've got to figure out which segment you're going to go after, right? I'm sure you guys have heard this. Which vertical, which segment, which customer type you're going to identify, and you're going to build the first market. So we had identified this customer type. It was working. We pivoted during the pandemic because we believed it was the right thing to do to someone else. It didn't work. We came back to the ones that were working, and we continued to work there. But we wasted 18 months along the way.
So 10 years ago-ish, thermometers coming online. I remember talking to you like maybe 5-6 years ago, and you're talking about health weather and the idea of forecasting. Amazing thought. 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, what is it we're going to be seeing from Kinsa that we're going to?
I do expect that the ultimate win for me is that you've got a global early warning and forecasting system for spreading infectious illness. It helps with the detection of pandemic threats, but pandemics are not every year. It is also helping with seasonal things. For us, that's COVID and flu. For the rest of the world, it's a bunch of other things too. And could you imagine a world where there wasn't spreading infectious illness? Or could you imagine a world in which you were alerted exactly correctly the times that you needed to take care, as opposed to the way that you're being alerted today, which is all the time? Like, you need to take care for the next 2 weeks. These 2 weeks are where you're going to see 80% of the spike. Like, if you actually look at the way flu spreads, for decades, 80%, between 40 and 80%, depending on the location, of morbidity and mortality is associated with about a 2-week horizon. You can tell the people who are most vulnerable, in the case of flu or COVID, it's those over 60. These are the 2 weeks you need to take care. And oh, by the way, it's done. It's done at the end of that. We found one of the ways that we alert the public is by saying, you're done. You don't need to take care anymore, or your risk is so much lower now, you can relax a little bit. We build credibility with our 4 million users by doing that, as opposed to the general ways that you've seen on the news, which is always, all the time, constant, right? So those are the kind of things that I hope exist in the world that will dramatically reduce morbidity and mortality for infectious disease. And with respect to something that is as crazy spreading as COVID, hopefully we get to contain it before it spreads to a broad community, unlike what happened in the world. Because then you're left with this reactive hammer response. Close everything down. Let's get ahead of it so you can contain it to a very, very isolated area before it gets out. And that's the answer in most cases.
Exciting stuff. Can't wait to see what happens. We'll turn over to some student questions. We have Sebastian is over here. Go ahead and raise your hands.
I'm seeing some heads go down. Ask me some questions that will get your heads back up. So.
Hi. So going back to what you were saying about how you were experiencing emotional ups and downs, what convinced you to keep going after that, even after you could tell it was negatively affecting your mental health?
Yes, it was definitely negatively affecting my mental health. It was definitely affecting my relationships. It's the passion. Like, I don't think I would have forgiven myself if I gave up.
What do you say to people with privacy concerns about having a connected health device at home? And then my second question is, data collection processes usually have a subsequent data cleanup process, and so what does that look like for Kinsa?
So I'm really glad you asked this question. I'm going to tell you something, and those of you in computer science probably know this. You can have both perfect personal privacy protection and access to aggregated population health insights, population insights of any sort. You can have both. And those that don't believe that don't understand how you can have both. Until 2019, we didn't even know the user's email address. We specifically designed the product to get aggregated population health data. I don't want to know who you are. And our users protested. They rebelled against us. Moms would tell us, I switched phones and downloaded your app. Where's all my data? And I would say, sorry, I don't know who you are. I can't give you your historical data. Sorry, I don't know who you are. So they rebelled against us and said, we need a login to like store all of our historical data in the cloud. One of the big features is tracking. Like, I can know when my child fell ill. I can show it to the doctor. I can get better care. But they would lose it. So you can have both. The technology infrastructure exists to do both. And we are incredibly proud of having done a lot of this well before the California, European laws on this stuff. You can delete your data anytime you want. We store your data in a separate database. We don't touch it. It takes 2 of my people to go in and maintain that data. That is purely a user database. We pipe everything through and completely anonymize it, and that's where we do the insights. Data cleansing is a challenge in any business. It is a place where data engineering, there's a lot of data engineering work. And so we have a department of data engineering, we have data scientists, and then we have the software engineers who build the front-end tools and the back-end tools behind that. And it is a challenge, I'll just say that. But you can have both.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I have a question about the technical stuff.
Sure.
First, how does your product work? And second, why is the headphone jack so important? Because a lot of earbud companies, they switch to the Type-C port. Is it hard to switch from the headphone jack to the Type-C port? Or what about how the product works relies so much on a headphone jack?
Yeah, to be clear, these are all Bluetooth, right? All of our thermometers today are Bluetooth. They connect to the app. This is the consumer product. This is not the insights product, the data product. This is one way that we collect unique data that enables the data product. The reason we used the headphone jack to invent the connected thermometer was strictly a cost choice. We made the lowest cost IoT product ever created because it didn't have a processor, it didn't have an LCD, it didn't have a power device. It was plastic and wires. And we were leveraging the headphone jack to do the resolution of temperature at an FDA level of accuracy. We are incredibly proud of this technology. And so I could make that product for under $1 at low scale. At scale, I could make it for, tens of pennies. Imagine a product that has an FDA clearance as a medical device, but you could give away left, right, and center, right? You could give it away to millions of people for free. That was the original premise I pitched the VCs on. We're going to get the data because we're going to give this away for free to everyone and anyone. It was a choice that we made on the technology because it was a cost choice, strictly a cost choice. I want to be in developing world countries. If I can make it for tens of cents, maybe I can be, even if it looks high-end and Apple-esque. Apple put us in a TV commercial in 2013, 14, right after the FDA clearance. So they gave us a bunch of awards. It was great design, but it was dirt cheap. This is not dirt cheap. This is Bluetooth. This is expensive. There's licensing fees. If you wanted to use USB-C or Lightning Bolt from Apple, you paid a licensing fee that was more expensive than the cost of my thermometer. So that was the challenge. It was strictly a cost choice. And we made the wrong choice because they took the headphone jack away.
Great. We have time for one more question. Sebastian, go on. Sure, go ahead.
I'm going to switch gears for a bit here, but I wanted to touch on that point of like your colleagues really wanting you to stay. And my question is, what are the 1 to 2 core traits that have made you the kind of person who could both connect with your colleagues and inspire their faith in you?
Well, let me be candid about it. I don't think they want to be CEO. I think they've seen what I've gone through, if I'm being honest with you. One of them has told me that. I've worked with this person for 15 years. They're like, there's no way I want your job ever. But, so I think that's one of it, to be clear. I think they believe, right? And I think credentials matter, experience matters, smarts matter. But I've learned the hard way that I would choose a person who's passionate about the same problem I'm trying to solve any day over the PhD from Harvard. Any day of the week, I'll choose the person who is passionate about the problem we're trying to solve. And though my colleagues are passionate about the problem we're trying to solve, we believe in each other, we believe in the problem, we're there doing it together. And it's not, these are colleagues that, like, I do not consider them employees. These are late-coming co-founders. And if you're lucky, you'll have many of those through your journey as an entrepreneur. If you're lucky, I'm very lucky. I have a number of late-coming co-founders. They are truly co-founders. I call them, I often say things like, you should consider these people co-founders if a new executive comes on, right? They are co-founders.
And we're lucky to have you. Thank you.
Yes, please. Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know. Did I